Hi, Karma. It is an absolute pleasure to have you here today. And for everybody who's seeing us, Karma Cottman is a leading advocate for Black communities impacted by domestic violence and is serving as CEO to the fantastic organization Ujima, who deals with these issues. Karma, again, a pleasure to have you. We're here celebrating the day of International Day for Elimination of Violence Against Women. What do you think that represents or should represent for all of us, but particularly for women of color?
Well, first, let me say thank you so much, Pamela, for bringing voice to these issues and for highlighting this very important day. The International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women makes I'm almost choked up about what it means for us as women of color and particularly for Black women, because what we know is that we are disproportionately impacted by violence, that we experience domestic violence and sexual assault at higher rates, that we are murdered at rates higher than other women, that we experience barriers at incredible rates, and that there is the need for education, for a shift in the way that we approach violence against women, and particularly how we talk about the experiences of violence for women and for women of color.
And Karma, I think it would be great for people who are seeing us right now to try to understand some of those particular barriers that Black women face when they're trying to get help or just even understand that domestic violence.
Absolutely. So, I always want to start with talking about the impact of oppression and bias in the lives of Black women. Here in the U.S., what we know is that Black women are 3 times more likely to be murdered by an intimate partner, particularly when there is a firearm involved. Across the world, we know that Black women experience violence at higher rates. And one of the things that is important for me to highlight is that does not mean that our communities are more violent. And I will say that over and over again, that does not mean that our communities are more violent. What it means is that Black women and women of color in general are positioned to experience violence at higher rates. It means that the social constructs that occur across the world to ensure that we experience poverty at higher rates, that we don't have access to education, that we don't have access to things like clean water and housing, position us to experience violence at higher rates. And then when you add the layers on of systemic bias, so that when we call law enforcement, we're not believed, that we're sexualized, so that when we talk about having experienced sexual abuse or sexual assault, that people think that we have done something to bring that sexual assault on ourselves. So we're asked questions like, what did you do? How short was your skirt? Why were you walking in this place at this time? When it happens in our families, what did you do to bring this on to yourself? When we're experiencing violence, we're asked, why are you doing this to this other person, as if we're not people ourselves? And then we're not seen as victims, not in our own communities and not by systems. We're expected to be strong. And so then that strong moniker, that we don't see ourselves as victims when we're asked about our experiences. Very rarely do you hear women of color expose or talk about having been victimized. We talk about what's happened, but we don't personalize it in that same way. And so those barriers then mean that when we try to seek help, we're not believed. We don't receive it. When we tell in our own communities or our families, people tell us to just grin and bear it. When we talk about it amongst each other, we don't talk about the experiences of victimizing. We really rely on, well, how can you help yourself, right? And so all of those things end up being barriers to us, one, seeking assistance. Our ability to seek assistance look different. But then when we do seek assistance, the ability for systems to respond effectively.
I think you touched a point around bias that is very important because some people might feel like they don't have that, or like the community at large might not have that. And I want you to, like, if we can in a minute, talk a little bit about you spoke into some of the impact that bias has, but what become then the real challenges as a consequence of that? For example, somebody going to the police and not being believed.
Right. So, for women of color, there are things exactly what you said, Pamela. We go to law enforcement and we're not believed, or we reach out and we may not speak the same language. And so materials and information are not available for us to navigate systems. When we go in front of courts, we're not believed. And so we don't have the same remedies. We're not expected to receive the same economic support. So we don't get things like child support and other kinds of economic benefits that women see. When we think about even the economic system, because we are expected to live in lower socioeconomic levels, or we're expected to be impoverished, right? We're not expected to achieve. Then when we reach out and seek financial assistance, again, we experience those same barriers. And all of those things are signals to survivors, right? All of those things are signals to survivors to just bear the violence that they're experiencing, in whatever form, because you won't be believed or you won't receive the assistance that you need. It can be something as simple as when you call law enforcement and they respond, do they see you as the victim or do they see you as someone who's aggressive, right? Or when you are seeking assistance from a child welfare or a child support systems, then they say, are you putting your child at risk versus what can I do to help you to keep your family safe? Those are the kinds of things that women and women of color experience when they're seeking assistance and seeking help.
Karma, I would love to learn a little bit about Ujima does, but before we get there, there's a lot of organizations that support women of color that might be seeing you today. And we know organizations have challenges when supporting minority groups. It's the type of organization that we see that drops off more quickly, that gets that support. But just your experience of leading an organization that supports women of color, what are some of the challenges that, organizations face?
Absolutely. And thank you for lifting that up, Pamela, because that's a very real challenge for what we call culturally specific organizations. And from us, that's organizations that led by and for communities of color. And so one of the things that we experience and we see, again, the same biases in the systems that we're talking about respond to survivors exist for those organizations seeking to serve those survivors. So things like when we are looking for and seeking for financial assistance, again, the idea that culturally specific organizations can't manage their funds, so they don't receive the same assistance. We often hear that those culturally specific organizations don't have the capacity, and I'm starting to just feel just very almost get this visceral response when I hear capacity for culturally specific organizations, because it's used to kind of keep those organizations down. So we don't have the same philanthropic support. We don't have the same governmental support. We experience bias in things like banking and financial institutions when trying to get loans and other kinds of assistance. And so those same kinds of biases that exist in systems when we're talking about the individual survivors exist for culturally specific supports, for culturally specific organizations. The other thing that I will lift up, Pamela, is that right now, what we're seeing is a backlash, a very real backlash around communities of color and women. And so culturally specific organizations are experiencing that, where entities may have invested in them for the last, 3, 4, 5 years are now pulling back on those investments. And that's impacting culturally specific organizations as well.
Which are groups that need the most, and organizations, suffer the most. So that is an important message. In a minute, Karma, what does Ujima do, and what message would you like to leave everybody with on this day of elimination of violence against women?
So Ujima is an organization, we are a culturally specific organization that addresses domestic violence, sexual assault, and community violence in the Black community. We do training, we provide technical assistance, we do policy, advocacy, and most importantly, systems change and community engagement and community awareness. At the center, as is evident in our name, at the center is mobilizing our community to address and end gender-based violence. And so what I would leave our listeners with today is that this is possible, but it requires that we all come together to address and end gender-based violence. It means that we work together to change the narrative. It means that we work together to protect women and girls. And it means that we center those women and girls that experience violence and are the most vulnerable.
I love that. Ending violence against women is possible. Karma, thank you so much for your love, your support, and your wisdom on this topic.
Thank you, Pamela. Thank you so much.